you write books, you write articles, you publish for Yale University Press, for Oxford and Cambridge. You're a music advisor for dictionaries, you lead research projects, you're a leading authority on Richard Strauss, and on top of that, you regularly lecture here at the Royal Academy of Music, making those sleepy and tired students awake on Monday mornings. And you teach conducting to young musicians who, at their first lessons, very often can barely synchronize their arms, and who by the last lesson turn out to be equipped in those most needed, most important basic conducting skills. And it's amazing. I dare to say that it is hard to find another person in this building who would be as busy as you are, and that it is equally difficult to find someone who would have as much energy as you do. So my question is very practical.
Sure.
How do you go about organizing your time, your commitments, your activities, and what's a secret behind being such an active teacher and scholar?
The essence of anybody with a busy schedule is the foundations you get as a young person. So when I'm working with people here, I'm very aware that the idea is that we put in place the foundations for the future. So my model of this is, of course, the great Sir John Pritchard, who was not only my teacher, but one of my dear friends and a huge father figure as well. And for somebody like John, who towards the end of his life, and I'm writing about him, funny enough, for a record sleeve as I speak, conducted and was in charge of the Oper der Stadt Köln, which was one of the four great German opera houses before the fall of the Berlin Wall, Brussels Opera, BBC Symphony Orchestra, and of course the San Francisco Opera. Now, he would regularly be on an aeroplane going somewhere. But a lot of what he did with those great institutions was set in place as a young musician. And how you organise your time really depends on what's coming up pretty much next most of the time. And you have longer and shorter projects. So you'll be looking at the idea of something that may take place or need to be published in 5 years' time, or 4 years' time, or something that you need to do next month. You are constantly juggling the whole time these things. You are taking things from elsewhere. You are a bit like Bach in some ways, where you might use bits of cantatas elsewhere in other cantatas and other bits of masses or what have you. Yeah? So you are constantly being a bit of a musical magpie most of the time. And in doing that, you are kind of putting in place a kind of schedule of work for yourself as well. But around that, of course, if you're working in a big institution like this, there are the kind of practicalities of term time. So if I'm working to a term time schedule, I pretty much have all my teaching, my class teaching, on a Monday and Tuesday. So on a Monday, I'll start at 9 and finish at 6 without a break. Same on Tuesday, give or take. But because of the way I work, I find that exhilarating. And so I never get tired from that. And because of the diversity of the young musicians that you have in front of you, it also makes you actually puts you on your mettle. That's the expression I'm after. Puts you on your mettle, because you're constantly having to think about what they need rather than what you need. And so along with that work, you're then writing on other days. You're then maybe off conducting. You may be off, as I am, in the summer to Australia to give masterclasses in conducting. I will do a public lecture there for our alumni network. I will do a radio interview that will actually last 2 hours, which is actually more like a radio documentary. That happens every time. In the summer last year, I was making films for Glyndebourne. I was doing a podcast. I was doing their education day. I was doing their pre-opera talks. And of course that was on Rosenkavalier, which is something obviously I know about. So you're picking and choosing the whole time. You're looking at what you can do. The trick is to be able to say no occasionally. Generally I don't say no. I generally say yes, and that's the problem really. I generally say yes. And that comes from the old days where I was still a performing musician, which I don't for medical reasons now, where if you didn't say yes, they would get somebody else. And so at the back of your head, you have the old days of being a performing musician where yes was more important than no.
Well, you mentioned that those 2 days, Monday and Tuesday, when you're teaching in the morning until the end of the day, that they're not tiring for you. Now, of course, teaching is one of your main activities, and would you be able to tell me what's, in your opinion, the most wonderful thing about teaching? And on the other hand, is there something which you find annoying in that profession? Because, as we know, teaching is not an easy job.
Well, the Monday, if we look at the Monday again, the kind of the variety of teaching let's talk about that for a second. So on the Monday, I will start with all the second years, so you'll have 100 of them. 2 weeks ago, for example, that Monday then extended till 9 o'clock because I was doing a Henry Wood lecture, which actually, in fact, is an interview. And I was on stage with various people. 1 week, for example, was an interview with Jonathan Freeman Atwood and Daniel Bempina about the art of recording. Absolutely. And then after that, the following week, it was to do with the history of the trombone, with a lot of trombonists and a lot of singers. And so that will extend. In doing that, it's the same if I'm actually then working with the Barbaroli lectures, which tend to be these days interviews with very famous people. And they will last up to 2 hours on stage, which obviously requires preparation. Now, each of those activities is teaching. So you will find that in a building such as this, I will start with pretty much the second years and go to everybody, including the postgrads, the PhDs, and people from outside. So when I'm actually working with people, it will vary hugely. So in a Henry Wood, for example, or a Barbaroli lecture, I will have, again, people from first year to PhD. I'll have people from outside, and that also fulfills kind of part of our remit for further education. So the idea is that you're not constantly just looking at one year group, you're not looking at one band of age, you're looking across the spectrum. And somehow you need to pitch it such a way that everybody gets something out of this. You won't hit the target every time, but the aim is for everybody to walk away thinking, I've learned something tonight, or I want to go and explore this further. That's the essence. It's not actually that you can teach everything. You can't. Nobody can. Nobody can teach everything. Nobody should even begin to think they can teach that much. That's foolhardy and vain. But what you can do is actually suggest to people, here's an opportunity, explore it. That's the important point, yeah? And I don't find it in any way problematic. I suppose problematic is the kind of logistics of it. Things have to be set up. You need photocopies. You need materials because that's just life. Yeah. But the practice of teaching, the practice of performance, is no different. The difference between conducting and teaching and writing a book, which are the kind of disciplines I do, writing articles or whatever, it's the same. It's all to do with communication. It's all to do with teaching and actually extending somebody's experience.
Mm-hmm. Well, that variety of people that you come across and that you have come across during your career is quite remarkable. And I'm wondering, amongst all those famous film directors, performers, singers, instrumentalists, all those people whom you've met, was there one meeting that you like to recall, that you remember especially well, and that made a special impact on you, perhaps?
I think they all make, and I know this is the kind of answer that everybody gives, but I know that they all make a different impact in different ways.
Yes.
I think that you're very aware that with singers, they're great on stage once they get going, and they get a little bit nervous to start with because they're no longer behind another persona. They're themselves. Yeah. Conductors tend to be very interesting with this. Mark Elder, for example, who I've known for a long time, well, Sir Mark, for example, is a great talker on stage, and he's wonderful with it because he comes with such a body of knowledge. He is a true communicator. Somebody like my friend Gwyneth Jones, Dame Gwyneth Jones. She, again, is somebody who has such experience, somebody who understands that as a young singer you need to start quite young and you need to be on stage and working. She started in her early 20s and is still working now, going towards her 80s. She makes films, she makes production on stage as a one-woman show. She produces, she directs, she sings. She's sung all the Verdi roles, all the Wagner roles. Somebody who has this huge experience and who loves communicating and loves teaching. In fact, As we speak, she'll be coming back to London to do masterclasses in London, and she's very keen to get young people. And what struck me about Gwyneth in particular was that she was very keen that her experience should actually benefit the young. And this is the one thing. It's not so much the one particular person that has struck me. What has struck me is their urge for these great figures, and many of them are the world's leading experts in their field or exponents, is that their urge is always to help the young. And vanity really is very rare, actually, you know, which is very interesting. It's their concern to actually make music live that's important to them.
Having to work with such a variety of personalities, would you say that a musician, someone like you, has to be a little bit of a psychologist as well at the same time?
Well, you do to a degree, but that comes with the turf, as they say, yeah. Because as somebody who trained as a conductor and trained to teach as well, you get used to having to work with people. And to quote Barbaroli here, really, in a famous documentary from 1964, he talks about the idea of how he has to sometimes encourage people, a player. Sometimes he actually needs to just drag something out of somebody. And you learn very quickly that everybody is very different. And somehow you learn how to actually get the best out of them where possible. It won't always work. It won't always work, but your aim is constantly to extend their experience, as I said earlier. And yes, there is a degree of psychology amongst this, and you have to learn that you're not important. This is the essence that the person who is actually at the front is not important. And this is not false humility.
Yes.
One has to know this. If you don't know this, it's a disaster from the outset. Because if you think it's going to be a wonderful experience of narcissism or vanity, then everybody loses, including oneself. So you're always looking at how you can best extend the experience of the group as well as the individual, because the group is made up of individuals. And generally, as I'm doing now, one looks at people's eyes, and you can see immediately around the room, around the orchestra, around the auditorium, their eyes. That's why I generally like interviewing people in things like the David Yusufovitz recital hall rather than the Duke's Hall, because you can see the audience and you can see the person you're interviewing, and you can work with both, because you are the conduit to both, between both, I should say. That's important.
Now for something completely different. I sometimes have an impression that, especially in this building, we don't always realize what an exciting, inspiring and thriving place we live in. Now I'm curious, what made you want to come to London, and what makes you want to live here?
Well, as a young musician growing up in Sydney at high school, and at the Sydney Conservatorium, which was then called the New South Wales State Conservatorium of Music, which famously also educated people like Sir Charles Mackarus, Yvonne Minton, Richard Bonning, Joan Sutherland, the list goes on. I mean, it was a tremendously exciting place. What you learn very quickly, that you're actually in a diaspora, you're actually part of something a long way away. And although when I was a young student in Sydney, the Opera House had just opened at Sydney, and everybody came. Bernstein came, Serkin came, Berio came, all Bigot Nilsson came, and they all came and gave classes at the Conservatorium, which was a wonderful experience. It was a kind of golden period of this. And so that was truly tremendous. And I'd always order a thing called Music and Musicians. It was a magazine which is now since stopped publication, stopped being published. And at the back of Music and Musicians, there was always a list of all the British concerts. And you would see this, and this was unrepeatable in Australia because of the sheer volume and density of what took place in London. Now, nowhere in the world actually had that density of musical activity, as far as I could see it. And I was very keen to come. But really and truthfully, the kind of eureka moment was when I saw Sir John Pritchard, who was John Pritchard then, conduct Don Giovanni at the Opera House. It had just opened, and it was a matinee performance. I remember to this day this fabulous blue jacket and this fabulous downbeat he gave that made this orchestra sound so much better than it really was. And it was a tremendous moment, and from that moment I knew that I had to work with that man. And I listened
to
him
in Sydney.
I heard him in Sydney. Yeah. I heard his recordings, which I really, really loved, I have to say, and they've made a huge impression on me. But this was a moment, my eyes opened. I mean, I sat at the back with the stalls way up high, and I can still see it now as I speak. It was a tremendous moment. Terrible production, lots of flying bananas, which he could never quite work out. I did explain phallic symbols in the end. He said, that's what it was, man. And saw that. Then I was very lucky. I had conducting lessons with somebody who now teaches in this building, Peter Robinson, one of the best musicians I've ever known, one of the nicest and kindest men, and also hugely bright. And he'd been a Kleinborn, and he'd worked with John Pritchard. And I said, is it possible? And John had come back to Australia to conduct again, Così, Fan tutte, and Macbeth. And the last night of his stay, Peter rang me and said, you must come now. John really would like to have a chat with you. I've explained who you are. We met, the interval, we got on like a house on fire. The interval extended, as John had a habit of doing, and the orchestra was still sitting there. He then said, come back at the next interval. So I did. He signed all my bits and pieces like all young musicians do, and it was wonderful. He said, you should come to Cologne. I'm not sure he expected me to do so, but he said, you should come to Cologne. He did mean it, actually. And so I did the following year, because he'd moved from London. He'd actually left London to start at the Cologne Opera, British Köln. And there, he taught me. And he said, well, I don't really know, I've never really taught before. I don't really know how to do this. And so he said, well, the best thing to do is what Fritz Busch and Thomas Beecham did with me. And that was to sit me around the pit and on the podium with him for performances and also rehearsals. And that was a hugely important moment for me, because I could actually see the working practices of a great orchestra, the Götzenich Orchestra, with a great conductor. And in those days, you actually had really very famous singers singing there. Many of the people I've now since interviewed here and got to know. And in fact, the day I arrived, I hadn't told John I was there just yet, and it was a Clemenza di Tito with the great Yvonne Minton, who I've also interviewed several times here, singing in the principal role, Sextus, one of the principal roles. And I was queuing up at the box office, and I must have said something with my Australian accent, and the lady in front of me said, you Australian, love? And I said, yes, I am. She said, I'm Yvonne Minton's mother. Would you like a ticket? And I said, yes, I really would. That'd be really lovely. And I was talking about this to Yvonne. She said, was my mother actually there? I said, well, in fact, somebody said she was your mother. I'm not quite sure whether she was or not, but she gave me a ticket nonetheless, and she was Australian. And so that was a tremendous experience of actually working in Cologne. I did that for 2 years, and then John was a very practical man. He simply wouldn't give people work if he didn't think they could do it. And I somehow got a concert at St John Smith Square, which was an all-Mozart program. It was Australia Day 1980, just by sheer coincidence. And Clemenza di Tito started the program. I did the overture, the two Sextus arias, and Little March. Then the rest was Mozart. And John came to the rehearsal. He was terribly ill. He had terrible flu, and he was not really well at all. But he came along. He said, you can do this. And he said, now we can work together properly. You can now work with me. He said, in the Mozart 34th Symphony, there was a horn entry. He said, I know you heard he missed it because your body language told me, but you didn't look. Always look. Don't be nasty to them, just look. And of course, from that moment on, I worked with him for the next 10 years or so. And my first job was preparing and conducting at the Berlioz Requiem with the Philharmonia, doing all the 4 brass bands, preparing all the choirs at the City of London Festival in 1980. That was a tremendously difficult job, one of the hardest, because you're up in the dome, you're hearing things all the time at different times, all the things are hitting you differently. Very, very difficult job, but it was a good training. And the one thing I learned, John was a very kind man, and very, very smart, and very, very quick, very quick. is that if you couldn't do it first time every time, really you're of no value in London. And that's the one thing you learn about being in London. And then being brought here by Jonathan Freeman Atwood was truly wonderful. He'd read some of my work as well, and that work was only published due to the help of the great Cyril Ehrlich, who was one of the great writers, one of the finest social historians of music in the world, and one of the smartest men I ever met. And Cyril read some of my material when I was doing my PhD after I had to stop because of my back, and he recommended me to Yale University Press, and that's how my first book started. And from then, I've now, in the last 20 years, published something in the vicinity of about 1.3 million words, I think, which is quite a lot. Yeah.
It is, absolutely.
In different media. So there are books, there are articles, there are record sleeves, you know, the whole shooting match.
My last question is a bit personal,
Sure.
if you don't mind.
No, not at all.
And I would really appreciate a honest, frank answer. How many coffees a day do you drink?
Well, the essence of anybody is that one should drink as many coffees as one can a day, which is probably about 10 a day, I suspect. And if one is going to be wired, I'm pretty much wired on caffeine. But it really kicks in and it makes me work.
And which one is this?
Well, this is actually number
Today.
4. There you go.
And it's not even midday.
No,
Good.
it's not midday, but I'm writing today, and I need to write because I'm actually leaving for Europe on tomorrow to actually make some more, you know, amendments to my most recent book.
Yeah. Okay. Wonderful. Thank you.